We're so glad to have you here. What a treat for all of us. And I just want to say one more time, thank you for being with us today.
Thank
we
you.
appreciate you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I think we would all benefit from just first hearing a little bit about your story. I think we'd love to hear about your family, and we'd love to hear about how you became a follower of Jesus.
Yeah. So I was raised in California, spent most of my life in California, graduated high school. Around that same time, I have an older brother who is now a pastor. And my father became a Christian around the same time around where I was graduating high school. And they would share the gospel with me, and they would call me all the time. And I would allow them to talk to me, but I was really not trying to hear it because I loved the nightlife. That was just things. And I wanted to go to college and just to experience college and all its glory. And coincidentally, I decided to go to school at Tuskegee University, about 2 hours south of here. I think it's south, but yeah, 2 hours south of here. And I made the decision, a terrible decision of attending a Bible study my first semester there. And the Lord snatched me up quickly.
Amen.
And so it's actually the greatest decision I've ever made. It was through campus outreach.
Was it a pretty girl that invited you?
No, it was actually a very ugly male. And
the Lord works in mysterious
He
ways.
works in very mysterious ways. And one of the things that my brother and my father wanted me to do, they were like, look, we're not going to tell you how to live your life necessarily, but please just try to go to a Bible study. And so I made that decision to go to a Bible study. And it didn't take long for the Lord to impress on me his laws, his statutes, the things that he loved. And at that point, I made some really tough decisions about friendships I had, relationships I was going through. And the next semester, I decided to do a summer project through campus outreach. I saw a couple people clapping. So some of you guys may be familiar with some of the summer projects they do. One summer project was here in Birmingham. And that's where I met this pretty lady.
Here we go.
Yeah, the Lord used that program. So here in Birmingham, we stayed at Birmingham Southern. And I met this young lady, and she was just amazing. She was all the things that I felt like the Lord was trying to develop in me. And we got married a couple years later, ended up moving to Texas, had 2 children in Texas. And then around 2008 is when about 25 individuals from our church in Texas decided that they wanted to relocate to Atlanta. And we relocated in about 2008, 2009. And around we have a daughter who now is 12, our son is 10. But when our son was around 18 months, we started to notice some things about his behavior that we didn't think were quite normal. And I worked at a residential treatment facility, and so I understood like stimulating behavior, I understood echolalia, I understood certain things, and I started to kind of reflect on those behaviors in those adults, and I just didn't want to accept it, and all the people around us was like, oh, don't worry, that boy will be all right, he's fine. He'll grow out of it, and so that's kind of like that was our MO for about a half a year. And then when he turned about 3 and we were in Atlanta, we decided that we really needed to make some really tough decisions and come to the grips that the Lord wasn't necessarily punishing us, but that we needed to be wise about seeking help and seeking assistance. And so that's kind of like was the introduction to our walk into this autism community and experience. And then 6 years later actually, we decided to have another child. And my wife was somewhat weary about having another child, but she just really trusted the Lord and believed that he would provide for us in ways that we desired for him to provide for us.
According to your plans.
Exactly. We had this contract with God. We were like, hey, we just need you to do this.
Yeah.
And
the contract you wrote.
Exactly, a contract that we designed. He said, please sign at the bottom.
Amen.
And he ripped it up, and he gave us a blank sheet of paper, told us to sign. And so with our second child, once again, we had a similar diagnosis, similar issues. And this time it wasn't as hard, I think, by this time we had connected with an organization called Culture City, who I know there's some wonderful people in here who are experienced with them, and it taught me. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I know this.
No, go, man, go. You got us.
It taught me a lot of things, not just about special needs or sensory issues, but it taught me a lot about being a father. And that last song we just performed, on the third verse, I talk about love not being based on performance. And the one thing that I learned, and it connected it to how I think our Heavenly Father engages with us, right? Our position is set, and He loves us, that He gave His Son for us. And so there's nothing we can do to earn His love.
Amen.
Positionally, we are there. And so no matter how well I perform, I will always be a son of the King. And in the same sense, my children, my boys especially, will never perform in the way that I ultimately desire them to perform. But yet and still, that doesn't change the way that I view them. That doesn't change their position with me, and it doesn't change the way that they love. And so from there, I really grasped this understanding of what true love and relationship is between a father and a son. And it's really affected even how I parent, how I view it. And before I would see this as a curse or some sort of punishment, but I see that this is something that has taught me, apart from marriage, there's been no greater sanctifying process like having children with special needs. And I think children in general, because I'm sure you guys have centrally typical children, you just want to strangle them every day.
Yeah.
But the reality is that even more so, I think that the Lord has taught me and shaped me to realize that I am, this life is not my own. You know, it's taught me how to live for the benefits of other people, how to be an advocate in everyday situations, and how to love unconditional. So
it's amazing how, for me, being a father has more than seminary even, has taught me about our Father in heaven. I remember I can remember putting the kids to bed one day and realizing that, you know, I would jump in front of a truck for them and I would have a smile on my face doing it. I'd be like, this is great. I can say, hey, no, I can do this for them. And just, you know, what a revelation that is for understanding God and His gift of Christ to us, that He, you know, was desiring to do anything for us. I want to ask you, so here you are as a Christian believer. You have two sons who have challenges with sensory processing and have autism. But you want to raise them probably in a Christian community. You came to Atlanta to start a church. You want to raise them where they can be a part of different communities, you know, be able to take them out to places where they can learn, they can have experiences. And I think that one of the things that's invisible to those of us who have what, I'm going to use your word here, sensory typical kids who don't have sensory processing issues, one of the things that might never occur to us is how many doors, intentionally or unintentionally, are closed to families with children like your sons. And so, if you don't mind, tell me a little bit in the spiritual context about closed doors that may have surprised you when you started in this journey with your kids. And I'm believing and guessing you wanted them to be a part of a faith community. So what happened next?
So I had somewhat of a special privilege because my brother and the other individuals who were pastors in our church, you know, I could tell my brother what to do, you know, so I know all this dirt growing up. So there was a lot of leniency with me. So as my son was 4 and 5 and he's not being able to acclimate within the Sunday protocol of children's church, they were like, well, that's Sho's son, you know, we'll figure out special privileges for him, you know. But as other families were coming in, they didn't really receive those same types of privileges. And I also recognized that my son's behavior began to wear on some of the staff. And
can you say more about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know,
break it down.
There'll be, you know, those conversations like, you know, we don't really know what to do with him, which means please don't come back.
Yeah,
really. And that affected my wife and I. So honestly, there would be times where we would just take turns going to church. Or one of us would be downstairs with them, and the other one would be upstairs. And then it got to the point where we were just like, you know what, let's not even just go to church. We'll have a devotional here. And we all know what that means. We're just going to sleep late and wait till a football game comes on.
That's what we're going to watch online means.
Exactly.
Too, I think
So it slowly progresses to lack of fellowship, honestly. And there becomes an obstacle for the gospel to go forth.
Well, it's not like families need another excuse not to go to church.
Exactly, right? And we had the greatest excuse in our mind, but
and honestly, you could. I'm just thinking about myself. I would think, well, I'm a victim here. It's not my fault we're not going, and that's the tact I would take totally. It's like, hey, we'd be there, but if you don't welcome my child, then that kind of gets in that whole protective father kind of thing too.
Absolutely. And I think the thing that began to not only frustrate me about not being able to feel welcomed in the church was the lack of communication about what does it mean to raise families with sensory disorders or to have kids on the spectrum or even special needs in general. I felt like there was a deficient or an anemic theology on those issues. And so it really began to weigh on me not to just be someone who complained about the issues, but say, well, what can I do to bring a healthy solution? And around the same time, I met Julian Maha, Dr. Maha, who is president of Culture City, and we just began to brainstorm. And so I just began to approach our church, and I started to talk about, like, what would it look like for us to be able to be a church that was welcoming for families who needed special services, or how can we start to train people? And so that's what we began to do. And so now families who were coming, who were previously leave, are starting to stay a little longer. And they're not just doing busy work. They're actually trying to engage them in gospel narrative. They're actually trying to teach them and communicate. Because one thing that oftentimes is we don't see these individuals made in the image of God.
Amen.
And I think that's one of the things that we have to begin to start to change is that we're not just
babysitting.
Babies, exactly. It's like we're trying to develop mature Christians in the ways that they may understand and the ways that they may be able to communicate. And I know my sons get it. My sons understand. And the more that I communicate to them, the difference is that they won't reciprocate it in the ways that I want them to reciprocate it, but they're capturing and they're getting the message. They're getting and I think the wonderful thing about Culture City is that they're teaching not just to bring awareness, but to bring advocacy. And so how are we beginning to change and to introduce a different understanding of who these individuals are in a very godly, Imago Dei way? And so I used to be ashamed to take them to the store. I used to be ashamed to get their haircuts. I remember one time my son literally threw a fit in the middle of getting his haircut, and he had like this Caesar kind of situation going on. And you know what? I was just like,
Hail Caesar.
Exactly. And I remember being so ashamed because everybody in there, and I knew what they were thinking, like, why can't he get a control of his son? And I remember one woman walking through the store, my son was throwing a fit, and she was like, baby, just leave him with me for a day. I'll get him right. And I was like, please. Because she didn't understand what she was saying. She just assumed that this was some child. So anyway, I think it's not just bringing awareness, but how do we begin to not be ashamed to integrate them in everyday society? So not just that people can become aware of their behaviors and understand the differences between children, but so that we begin to have courage, and because I know for a while that I needed to not only wrestle with the understanding that I need to integrate my children into everyday society, not just for their benefit, but for mine as well, and to not become ashamed of them. And then also the struggle of not feeling like I should get praise for doing something that I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
Right. Like this
as a dad,
as a
believer.
father. Yes, these are things that I am called to be sacrificial, to be loving, to be gentle, to be kind. And when people see me and say, "Oh, you're such a great father," I am supposed to reply, "Well, this is what the Lord has called me to do."
Yeah.
And so.
Well, let me say this. I think I want to speak to what you said about our kind of weak or impoverished theology when it comes to developmental challenges that people have, or things that people have later in life, that may affect their sensory processing. It could be Parkinson's, it could be dementia. There's so many different things, but I think the weakness of our theology is revealed in the fact that this becomes a passionate issue when it hits your family, right? And I see this in myself too, that I'm fired up about an issue that my kids deal with, right? But as believers, I just wonder, what does God think when we don't care until it hits us? Like, how does God look at that? Because that's like the opposite of how he is. He isn't a sinner, and yet his heart is broken for sinners. His son wasn't a sinner, and yet he created a movement for people not like his son, us, who have a problem that his own son didn't have, but that we all have. And it just gets me thinking about what if we had a passion for this, even if it's not something in our own family? Because there is a sense to me, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, because I could be, that in many faith communities, most faith communities, intentionally, unintentionally, willfully, unwillfully, wittingly or unwittingly, that we've excommunicated, and that means kind of to cut off communication, cut off community for people who can't receive the gospel in the way that we want them to. Like, sit there quietly. When the plate comes by, put something in it. Don't talk unless asked to speak, right? And even then in a Methodist church, don't, right? But the gospel doesn't tell people how they should hear the gospel. It tells us how we should share it. So let me just lay this on you, and you comment if you would like, all right? It's from Luke. One day while he was teaching, Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting nearby, and the power of the Lord was with him to heal. Just then some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a bed. Now back in those days, if you were paralyzed, people thought that you had done something wrong and God was punishing you for it. Like, they didn't understand science or medicine, so they thought physical infirmities had a spiritual rationale behind them. So this person would have been not just paralyzed, but probably a pariah as well. Some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a bed. They were trying to bring him in and lay him before Jesus. That's what they wanted to do. We want to get him before Jesus. But finding no way to bring him in because of the crowd, that's us, they went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles. They tore a hole in the roof. They ripped a hole in someone else's roof, seemingly without permission, and lowered him into the middle of the crowd. Now you should imagine when they start tearing a hole in the roof, dirt starts falling. This is like adobe, like clay, and people are looking up. And what does Jesus say? When he saw their, plural, when he saw their faith, the faith of the men who were lowering him down. Think about this is a really weird thing. When he saw their faith, the men lowering him down, he looked at the man who was paralyzed and said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven you." Not because of your faith, because of the faith of your friends. You have been brought before me. I think of my sins being forgiven because of my faith. But in this case, Jesus looks at these men who ripped the roof off and who tore up a house to get their guy here before Jesus. And Jesus looks at these guys' faith and then looks at the man and said, "Friend, because of their faith, your sins are forgiven." And so I'm thinking about, do we have people who are willing to rip any roofs off? To rip the roof, to tear down a wall, to get somebody to Jesus. The crowd shows carrying the guy. I'm in the crowd, and I'm looking there at Jesus because that's who I want to hear. Shows up behind me trying to bring his guy in. I think he's just trying to push and get ahead of me. All right, don't do that. And so what he's doing and the person with him is invisible. I think there's a lot of invisible people. The question is, are we the crowd that has their back turned? Or are we the ones holding the ropes? Yeah. And I just don't know, what would you add to that based on your experience in church or other people's experiences, having trouble finding a place to get before Jesus?
I would say there's two things that I think is pertinent to not only that story, but just the overarching theme of why it is important for the church to be on the forefront of advocating on this issue. Is one, that everything, you talked about community, and I think community and understanding that the gospel is an expression, is to be expressed in the context of community is so important. We think about the Trinity, the Godhead in community. We think about the church as a body of believers that come together. And oftentimes what we do is we think about Christianity in this personalized way, and we only see it as my only personal relationship with God. But nothing can be, when we talk about all the commandments of the scripture, when we think about the one another verses, it is a command to serve other people or to love one another. And the reason why that is so hard for us is because we desire comfort and we desire normalized action and processes. And when you try to bring other people or other systems or change systems, it just makes us uncomfortable, and it's just not normal to us. And when we go back to Genesis, we see that God not only created us to have a perfect reflection of Him and for our own personal life to glorify Him, but we also see that He created us to have perfect relationship with one another. And in Genesis 28, we see that He called us to create and cultivate for His glory. So not only are we to reflect Him in our own personal life and the way we act and carry ourselves, but we are to reflect Him in how we treat one another. And we also are to reflect Him in how we create and we cultivate and make systems. But because of sins, we corrupt that. And so now we want to be the gods of our own lives. We want to use relationships for our own benefit, and we create systems and we create institutions that only benefit us, that makes us comfortable. But the gospel is never that. The gospel is always about service and dying to ourselves and loving other people. And I think the reason why it's so hard and the reason why you'll see such great sacrifice of men lowering their fellow brother into the ruse is because they caught this concept that the gospel was not about their own personal flourishing.
Yeah.
It's how do I deny myself to love and service my brother? And it's going to be uncomfortable. It's weird that we're carrying this guy through this crowd. It's going to be hard work that we're tearing the roof off to lower this individual
We're going
down.
to jail for breaking this man's house.
But it's all worth it because what we've seen is not only are we going to we're seeing that this individual is going to benefit and their life is going to flourish because of the call of the gospel, not only on them, but to ourselves. So.
In institutions, we invariably drift towards thinking, what can the people out there do for us? Yeah. How can they get more, how can they support our church? What's in it for us? That's the institutional drift when you take Jesus out. I want to invite Roger Torbert to come up. Where are you, Roger? For a minute. Roger is the Vice President of Education at the zoo. And let me just put him by you there. He's the Vice President of Education at the zoo, and the zoo in our town is blessed for many reasons, one of which having Roger there to see that institutions exist for others to serve, and particularly a church, if it follows Jesus, is about serving. They felt a call as a zoo to reach out to families that have a child or a church member or a member of the family who has a sensory processing issue, and you led that. And first of all, how many zoos, at the time y'all started this, how many zoos in the world were doing this?
None.
No zoo in the world?
No, we were the first.
Birmingham was the first zoo to reach out to families like this. First zoo in the world, all right? The earth, also known as part of creation. And so I just want to ask you one question. Why? Why would y'all, when people say, well, that's not how we do things, that's not how we've always done it, it's going to cost us money. Same things churches say. They might tear something up or whatever. That's not. Why would you do that?
Well, it was interesting. I've always said that sometimes God puts people in your life and uses them to do His work. Well, several years ago, I had a friend who invited me to lunch with Julian Maha from Culture City. And the moment I met him, the first thing he said was, we really need to do something at the zoo. My kids love the zoo, but my son can only stay for a very short amount of time. So what can we do? And from that conversation, it kind of snowballed. It was amazing. Once I started hearing Julian's story, meeting these other families, and realizing what I take for granted that they weren't able to do as parents, take your kids to the zoo, go to a restaurant without...
Go to church.
Right, yeah, go to church.
As a family.
Right, yeah. And the interesting thing was, after we started looking at, what are the barriers that are in place, there are barriers as far as what we need to do to make life a little more accommodating for these people, but most of it was we have to shift the perception of what these kids are doing. They're not spoiled brats who are throwing a fit because they're not getting their way. They have things that they cannot tolerate.
Their minds work different.
Right, yeah, exactly. But after talking to a lot of these families, they were hesitant to take their kids into public situations because they didn't want people to judge them as parents. I like your story about the woman saying, just let me take him home for a day,
I'll fix him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
As if he's broken.
Bless her heart. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, once I realized that you said a disenfranchised group of people who weren't able to do things that we take for granted. I mean, what are the little things that we can do to make that happen?
How has that outreach worked at the zoo? How has that community and the larger community responded?
Oh man, so it's awesome. So we started out, we had two options basically. We as a group could say, okay, we know what these people need, so we're going to make these changes, and then they're going to come and they're going to be grateful that we made these changes. Or we could ask families, when you come to the zoo, what are some challenges that you have? And so our CEO actually gave us 200 free family memberships to 200. Actually, we started with 100, and 400 families asked to be part of it. And so that was a bit expensive. So we got 200 families to agree to be a focus group for a year. Come to the zoo, do surveys, let us know what you needed. And from that, we were able to kind of create our initiative. One thing that we knew was we need some quiet places for people to go, for kids to go when they get overstimulated. We need a quiet place. So we did a survey of our zoo and realized we have 3 or 4 quiet places, but none of the quiet places had a bench to sit on. And so that was when mom said, you got all these quiet places we can go to, but there's nowhere for us to sit. So we worked with the scouts. We got an Eagle Scout to build us some benches. We have headphones that people can check out now if they get overstimulated to sound. We have all kind of really cool stuff. And because of the work that we did, Culture City started what they're calling the Sensory Movement. And they've actually been working with McQuain Center, with Botanical Gardens, and now all of these places in Birmingham are sensory inclusive to these families. They can come in, you'll see this logo no matter where you go, and that lets these families know that you're welcome here. And also we're expanding to zoos all over the United States. Akron Zoos just started, launched their sensory initiative, Phoenix Zoo, the Bronx Zoo. We're spreading not just here, but all over the United States through the work that started here at Birmingham, which is awesome.
That is awesome. So one of the songs that you do is called Words, and in it you, in a way that brought, as a young father, brought tears to my eyes. Just thinking about it does right this second. It's just you're wrestling with what you think about when you're starting a family, what what we all envision if we have a family, what it's going to be like. You have this ideal vision of what that's going to be like, and then the contract changes. And as a believer, as a father, the process you went through in rethinking that. Would you be willing to share that with us, that song?
Absolutely.
All
yeah.
right, let's do it. Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much. Roger, thank you for coming up and sharing what you've been doing.